The broken girl and the strange visitor for 10 long years. Emily could not walk and her legs did not move, and she had forgotten how the ground felt under her feet. And she stayed in her wheelchair near the window every day watching other children run and play while she only watched in silence. She was 9 when the accident happened, and since that day her life had changed, and everything became dark and quiet inside her heart. And even the sun looked cold to her. Her mother cared for her with tired hands and quiet tears, and her father had left years ago, after the accident, saying he could not take the pain, and Emily stopped asking questions about him now. She was 19, and the house was small and silent, and smelled like old wood. Medicine, and the only sound she liked was the wind outside at night when it sang through the trees like it knew her pain. One night, the wind was louder, and the sky outside looked strange with purple clouds and silver lightning, but no thunder, and Emily felt something in her chest, like something was coming, and she could not explain it. She looked up at the sky and whispered to the stars, asking them if anyone could hear her, if anyone still cared, if anyone could help her walk again. And just then the door knocked softly. Her mother came rushing to the door and opened it a little, and then froze, and her eyes went wide, and she looked back at Emily like she saw a ghost. A man stood outside wearing a dark coat with glowing lines on the sleeves, and a round device on his wrist that blinked blue and green like tiny stars, and his eyes were calm but strange, like they had seen too much. He looked past the mother and directly at Emily, and he spoke in a soft, deep voice that made everything around him feel still, and he said one sentence only: "I can fix what your world gave up on." Emily blinked, and her mother shouted no, and tried to close the door, but the man did not move, and he said again that he came with answers and help, and not harm. Emily felt something deep inside her stir like a tiny fire waking up after a long sleep, and she asked softly, "Who are you?" The man smiled gently and said, "My name is Dr. Cade, and I am not from your town, and not from your country, and not from your planet. And I am here because she is important more than she knows." The mother grabbed Emily's wheelchair and said, "Leave us now, we don't need your tricks." But Dr. Cade raised his hand slowly and showed them a small device that floated in the air and projected an image. Showed Emily at age 9 lying on the ground after the accident with strange energy around her body that no one had ever seen, and the scene faded before her mother could scream. Emily looked at her mother and whispered, "How does he have this? How is this possible?" And Dr. Cade walked into the house slowly and said, "Because the accident was not just an accident, and she was not just a child." He sat on the floor in front of Emily and said he had come from far away to find people like her, people whose lives had been changed by a force unknown to Earth, a force that left something inside them sleeping. Emily asked, "What do you mean by something inside?" And Cade said, "There's a part of your mind that never stopped trying to move, and a part of your legs that never truly died, and I can wake it up." The room felt warmer, and the lights flickered as if responding to his words, and Emily's mother looked frightened, but Emily herself felt calm and alive for the first time in years. Cade pulled out a small scanner from his coat and asked, "May I?" And Emily nodded, and he placed it near her neck, and the scanner beeped softly, and a soft blue light shone from the screen. Cade looked at the result and smiled, said, "Yes, it is there. I was right." And Emily asked, "What is there?" And he said, "A signal, something very old and very powerful, and it is not human, but it is part of you." Now Emily looked at her legs and then at the stars through the window, and she felt her fingers tremble, and she whispered, "Are you saying I can walk again?" Cade looked at her and said, "No. I am saying you were never supposed to stop walking in the first place, and they made sure you forgot that truth, but now we are going to remember." Together Emily's heart beat fast, and her mother whispered, "Please don't give her hope if it's a lie." And Cade said, "Hope is not a lie when the truth is waiting inside her, and the truth is almost awake." A strange hum filled the room like music without sound, and Emily felt her spine tingle, and for the first time in 10 years, she could feel something in her toes. She looked down and tears fell from her eyes, but she did not cry out. She only looked at Cade and said, "What do I have to do?" Cade stood up and said, "Be brave and trust yourself and let the pain come, because it means your body is listening again, and when it does we will begin." Outside the wind howled, and the purple clouds above the house began to move in a circle, and something from the sky watched them as the first spark inside Emily began to glow. The morning light came slow and soft through the window, and the house felt different, like it was holding its breath, and Emily sat in her chair with her fingers shaking gently, and her eyes fixed on her toes as if they would move again if she stared long enough. Mother stood in the kitchen with tired hands and tired eyes, watching the stranger named Dr. Cad walk around the room, scanning the walls with a strange little floating ball that made quiet clicking sounds like it was talking to something unseen. Emily whispered to herself, "Did I really feel it, or was it just in my mind?" And her heart beat faster with each memory of the blue light and the hum that filled the room last night, like her soul had heard a forgotten song. Cade turned to her and said, "You felt it because it was real, and now that spark is awake, it will grow and change you. But we must be careful, and we must be quick, because the signal is not silent anymore, and others may be listening." Emily asked, "What kind of signal, and what kind of others?" And Cade knelt beside her and said, "When the accident happened, a pulse of energy entered your body and attached itself to your neural spine, and your brain began to protect it like a treasure hidden under fear and sleep." He said, "We call it the neural spark, because it is not metal and not machine and not alive, but still it learns and listens and waits until it finds the right path and the right purpose." Emily asked, "Why me, and what is it trying to do?" And Cade smiled a little and said, "Maybe it chose you, or maybe you were the only one strong enough to survive it, and now it is part of you, and it is starting to speak in the language of thoughts and dreams." He opened a case from his coat and took out a small glass orb filled with moving light like lightning trapped in water, and he said, "This is the neural key, and it is made to connect your mind with the spark, but only if you are ready to see yourself beyond the mirror of fear." Emily touched the orb with one finger, and a sharp flash ran through her spine like a voice whispering deep inside her brain, and she gasped, but did not pull away. And Cade said, "You are stronger than I hoped, and that means we still have a chance." Her mother stepped forward with worry on her face and asked, "What are you doing to my daughter?" And Cade looked at her with soft eyes and said, "I am not doing anything that is not already happening inside her. I am only helping her remember what her body forgot." Placed the orb on the table, and it floated above the surface, spinning slowly and glowing softly. And he said, "We begin now, and we begin gently, and if she wants to stop at any time, she can say the word and everything will sleep again." Emily said, "No, I do not want to sleep anymore. I want to walk again. I want to feel the ground. I want to run. I want to fly if I have to, and I want to know what I really am." Cade nodded and placed a small patch behind her neck, and wires extended from it into the orb, and for a moment everything in the room became still, as if time was holding its breath again. Then the orb glowed brighter, and Emily closed her eyes, and in her mind she saw light and sound and color she had never seen before, and she saw herself as a child falling in the lab and something golden reaching toward her from the machines. Saw shapes and symbols that danced in the air, and heard voices speaking in calm words she could not understand, but somehow she felt safe and warm and strong. Her body began to tremble, and her legs tingled like fire and ice at the same time, and her hands gripped the arms of the chair, and her breath came fast and shallow, but she did not scream. Cade watched closely and whispered, "She is sinking, and the spark is responding, and this is the first step of awakening. But it is not the last, and it will only get harder from here." Suddenly the orb pulsed red for a second, and Cade's face changed from calm to alert, and he tapped his wrist device and stared at the screen and said, "Something is wrong. Something else is trying to access the signal." He pulled the patch from Emily's neck, and the orb fell to the table and stopped glowing, and Emily gasped for breath, and her eyes opened wide, and she said, "I saw something. I saw a place not on this earth, and I think it knows me." Cade looked at her with quiet respect and said, "Then it has begun, and you are more than just a girl in a chair. You are now the carrier of something old and powerful and dangerous, and Beautiful outside, the sky darkened with clouds that were not like yesterday, and the wind carried a sound that did not belong to the earth, and far away something listened and waited for her next dream. Emily sat still in the same chair that had carried her for 10 years, and now everything felt new and strange and alive, as if her body was no longer quiet and her heart beat with a sound she had forgotten long ago. The room was silent, but her thoughts were loud and full of pictures she did not understand, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw patterns and lights in places that did not look like anything on earth. Cade stood beside her with the small glass orb in his hand, and his eyes were fixed on the tiny symbols that flickered inside it like fireflies trapped in a storm, and he whispered something to himself in a language Emily could not recognize. He turned to her and said, "Your brain has started to open the path, but it is not complete, and the spark is still hiding parts of itself, and we need to help it come forward without fear and without force." Emily asked, "How can we help it if we do not know what it wants?" And Cade walked to his bag and opened a silver case that hummed softly, and inside it was a device shaped like a band of light, and it floated slightly above the velvet lining, as if gravity was only a suggestion. "This is called the bridge," he said, "and it does not speak in words or touch or sound. It speaks directly to the mind, and it does not need language because it understands thought as pure energy and responds to emotions and memory and desire." Emily reached toward it, and the band rose higher as if it could feel her presence, and it glowed with a soft blue light, and her fingers tingled as they got closer, and she felt like the device was alive, but not breathing. Cade gently placed the bridge around her head, and the light dimmed for a moment before shifting into waves of color that moved in rhythm with her heartbeat, and the room filled with a low hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. "Close your eyes," he said, "and do not try to think. Just feel and let the bridge find the truth hidden inside you, and let it show the spark that you are ready to listen." Emily closed her eyes, and the chair felt less like a prison and more like a launch pad, and her breath slowed, and her hands rested on her lap as the hum grew deeper, and the light around her shifted to soft gold. In her mind, she saw a river of light flowing through a tunnel made of stars, and each drop of that river held a memory, and some of them were hers and some were not, and she followed the current without fear. She saw the accident again, but this time she saw more. And she saw the machine that exploded, and the blue flash that wrapped around her like a blanket, and she saw a figure in the light with no face and no name, and yet she felt love. The spark inside her spoke for the first time, not with voice, but with feeling, and it showed her a world that was broken, and a sky that bled light, and a ship falling through space, and she understood without words that something had been lost, and now it was inside her. Her legs burned, and her spine pulsed, and her fingers gripped the arms of the chair, and tears fell from her closed eyes, but she did not cry from pain. She cried from knowing that something deep inside her had waited a very long time to be seen. The bridge glowed brighter, and Cade watched closely as the data streamed into his wrist device, and he saw symbols that had not been seen for centuries, and numbers that matched nothing in any Earth database, and he knew then that Emily was more than a miracle. Suddenly the bridge flickered, and a loud, sharp tone rang through the air, and the light turned red, and Emily gasped as her body jerked forward, and the chair slid back, and Cade pulled the device from her head and held her shoulders as she trembled. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she nodded slowly and said, "I saw them. I saw the ones who made it, and they are not gone. They are sleeping, and I think they are watching me." Now Cade looked toward the window, and the sky outside was no longer clear, and a strange shadow moved across the clouds, like a ship with no sound and no shape, and he whispered, "They are early. They were not supposed to come yet." Emily sat up straighter, and her feet touched the floor, and she looked down and whispered, "I can feel the ground again, and I can feel my own weight, and it hurts, but the pain feels like truth." Cade knelt beside her and said, "You are awakening faster than I imagined, and that means we have little time, and they will want what is inside you, and they will not ask kindly." Emily looked at the glowing device on the table, and then at her legs, and then at the door, and said, "Then we will not wait, and we will not hide, and I want to know who I am and what they put inside me, and I want to stand outside the wind picked up and the trees bent, as if bowing to something far above, and the hum of the bridge still echoed in the walls, and in the center of it all, Emily sat like a star about to rise. The night came without warning, and the sky turned deep blue with streaks of violet like bruises across the stars, and Emily sat near the window with the bridge device resting beside her, and her fingers still trembling from what she had seen in her mind. Cade stood by the door, watching the sky with quiet worry on his face and his hand on his wrist device as if waiting for something or someone to call from far beyond the clouds. Emily spoke softly and asked, "What have they put inside me? And why does it feel like my thoughts are not just mine? And why do I hear things when everything is silent?" Cade turned to her slowly and said, "What you carry is not just a spark, it is a hidden program written in a language not made for human eyes and placed deep inside your mind where no one would look and no machine would detect." He walked toward her and said, "The accident you had was not caused by chance, and the lab you fell into was one of the last places on Earth where that alien code still lived, and when you touched that energy, it did not destroy you, it chose you." Emily looked at her hands and then at her legs and whispered, "Why me, and what does it want from me, and what happens if I fail to understand it?" Cade knelt in front of her and said, "You were a child with a mind open, like a book, and the code needed someone untouched by fear and full of hope and pain and loss, all at once, and you were the only one who survived the imprint." Pulled out a small silver disc and placed it on the side of her head, and the device lit up with golden waves that danced across her skin. And he said, "This will let us see what the code is doing inside you, and maybe we will find its true purpose." Room dimmed, and the air felt heavier like a storm waiting in silence, and Emily closed her eyes as the disc began to read her mind and project images into the air like shadows made of memory and light. She saw herself as a child again, laughing, running, falling, and then the lab and the explosion and the pain. But this time, the memory did not stop there, it kept going, and she saw wires wrapping around her spine and light entering her veins and something ancient speaking inside her. Cade watched the projection, and his eyes widened as the alien symbols formed in the air and began to move like a living map, and he said, "This is a seed, and it is growing, and it is learning from you, and it is becoming more than it was." Emily opened her eyes and said, "I hear it like a heartbeat, but it is not mine, and sometimes I feel like I'm walking in two worlds, one made of metal and fire, and one made of dreams." Cade said, "The code is unlocking pieces of your brain that humans do not use, and it is creating connections faster than we can track, and soon you may begin to see through space and time and memory as if they are doors you can walk through." He turned the disc off, and the images faded, but the feeling stayed like a taste in the air, and Emily looked at him with a strange calm and said, "I am not afraid anymore. I only want to know the truth." Cade said, "The truth is that this program inside you may be a message or a weapon or a tool or a living memory from a species that no longer walks the stars, and it may be trying to finish something they started long before Earth was born." Emily touched her forehead and whispered, "I can feel names in my blood and places I have never seen, and they feel like home, and they feel like mine, and I do not know how." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the floor shook slightly as if something had landed nearby, and Cade grabbed his scanner and said, "They are closer now, and they may have followed the signal when the bridge connected to your spark." Emily stood slowly holding the edge of the window, and her legs were weak but alive, and her body shook, but not from fear, and she looked into the dark sky and said, "Let them come if they must, I will not run." Cade said, "Then we must prepare, because what comes next will test everything inside you, and not just the strength of your body, but the truth inside your soul and the memory inside your blood." Outside, the wind howled, and the air smelled like metal, and the trees bent again under the weight of something invisible, and high above the clouds a red circle blinked once and then vanished. Emily closed her eyes and saw the same circle inside her dream, and it opened like an eye, and a voice filled her mind, saying, "You are the last gate, and the path will open soon." opened her eyes and whispered to herself, "I am not broken. I was never broken. I was only waiting to become something more, and now the wait is ending." Cade placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "Then let us see what the next door will show us, and let us walk through it together, even if it leads to the edge of the stars." The air was thick with silence, and the moon above the house was brighter than usual, and the stars around it looked pale, as if they were hiding behind something too large to name, and Emily sat awake in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes locked on the sky. Cade had not slept, and his back was against the wall, and his fingers moved across the screen of his wrist device without pause, and the numbers kept changing faster than before, as if something was racing toward them. Through the night, Emily whispered, "I dreamed again, and I saw the same world and the same ship falling through fire, and I heard my name being called by a voice I do not know, and yet it feels like it belongs to me." Cade looked at her and said then, "The spark is no longer dreaming alone, and now you are dreaming with it, and this is the beginning of the real change and the real danger, and you must be ready to face what lies inside you." She nodded without fear and said, "I can feel my legs more each day, and last night I moved my toes again, and the pain was sharp like lightning, but I welcomed it like an old friend because it meant my body was listening." Cade stood and took the bridge device from the table and placed it around her head. Again, and the room filled with that low hum that sounded like time itself breathing through the walls, and the air around them shimmered with unseen currents. "Close your eyes," he said, "and this time do not follow the light. Instead, wait and let it come to you, and when it does, do not run from what you see, and do not fear what you hear, because the spark is ready to speak." Emily closed her eyes, and her breath slowed, and her heartbeat echoed louder in her ears, and then the silence broke, and she was no longer in the room, and no longer in her body, and the world around her had shifted into something new. She stood on a field made of glass, and the sky above her pulsed with color and movement, and giant shapes floated in the air like sleeping gods, and the ground beneath her hummed with energy that came from her own mind. She walked without pain and without effort, and each step felt like music flowing through her spine, and her body was whole and strong and glowing with threads of light that moved under her skin like living veins of power. A voice called her name again, not loud, but full and deep like the sound of an ocean hidden inside the wind, and the voice said, "You are now awake, and the key has turned, and the code remembers itself through you." She turned and saw a figure made of light and shadow, and it had no face and no body. But it was not empty, and it was full of memory and sorrow and hope, and it reached out with one hand and touched her forehead, and a storm of visions filled her mind. She saw the fall of a civilization that had built wonders in the stars, and she saw machines taller than mountains and cities floating in the void, and she saw a war that burned through planets, and a last ship escaping with a secret hidden in its core. That secret was the spark, and that ship had found Earth, and the spark had waited until it found someone it could live within, and that someone was her. And now it had begun again through her. The voice said, "You are not only healed, you are reborn, and the path ahead will be fire and shadow and song and light. And if you walk it truly, you will become what we could not." Suddenly, the sky above cracked open with red light and a sound like thunder without end, and the dream shattered, and she was back in the room, and the bridge device sparked and fell from her head as her body twisted, and her breath came fast and wild. Cade rushed forward and held her steady and said, "It is all right, you are here, you are safe." And she looked at him with wide eyes full of tears and said, "I saw everything, and I felt everything, and I know who I am now." She stood up without help, and her legs shook but held her, and she walked 3 steps forward, and the ground felt like truth under her feet, and she said, "The world is bigger than anyone knows, and I have touched it, and I am no longer afraid." Cade looked at her, and his voice was quiet when he said, "Then the signal is complete, and the awakening is real, and now they will come. Not to test you, but to take you, and we must decide what we do before they arrive." A loud thud shook the walls, and the lights flickered, and the trees outside bent again under a heavy wind that came from nowhere, and in the distance a red glow appeared. In the sky, like a wound opening above the earth, Emily looked up, and her voice did not shake when she said, "Let them come, because I will not run, and I will not break, and whatever they are, I am more than what they expect, and this time I will choose my path." And far above the clouds, a shape began to descend, and the stars moved aside as something older than time came searching for the spark it had lost. Asterisk. The sky had turned the color of deep fire, and the clouds above the house moved in circles, like they were being pulled by something invisible and heavy and full of purpose. And Emily stood at the center of the living room, with her hands open and her legs steady and her eyes locked on the glow in the distance. Cade moved quickly from screen to screen as his wrist device blinked faster than ever before, and the symbols running across it had started to repeat and repeat, and then shift into patterns that did not belong to Earth or any language made by human minds. "They are here," he said. "Not just listening but watching, and not just curious but aware, and they know she has awakened, and they know the spark is no longer sleeping, and they will come to finish what they started." Emily stepped closer to him and said, "I want to see them. And I want to know what they are, and I want to understand why they placed this inside me and what they are." Afraid of losing, Cade looked into her face and saw no fear and no doubt, and he said, "Then you must know the full truth before they arrive, and before they decide what to do with the last key left in the universe." Took out a round silver disc from his bag and placed it on the table and pressed its center, and a soft hum filled the room as a three-dimensional image rose into the air and shimmered like water floating in space. The image showed a star field, and then a planet unlike Earth, covered in towers and rings of light, and ships flying through the sky like birds, made of crystal, and then explosions and fire and silence, and a ship breaking through the black with a trail of golden sparks behind it. This was their world, he said, and they were called the Kalari, and they lived not through time but through memory, and they built wonders with thought and with light and with sound, and then they destroyed themselves trying to keep their creations from falling into the wrong hands. Before they vanished, they placed pieces of their mind into codes and into machines and into energy, and they sent these pieces into space, hoping one would survive and carry the last message of what they had been and what they had hoped to become. One of those pieces came to Earth and entered your world through a broken satellite that fell from orbit and crashed into a lab and was never supposed to be touched, and yet you were there, and you touched it, and it touched you, and everything changed. Reached out to the image, and her fingers passed through it like mist, and she said, "Then the chip is not just a tool, it is a part of them, and it remembers, and it feels, and it has made a home inside me." Cade nodded and said, "It is more than memory, and more than code, and it is alive in a way we do not yet understand, and now that you have awakened it, the ones who created it, or the ones who destroyed its creators, will come, and they will want what is inside you." She looked outside the window, and the red glow in the sky was closer now, and shapes moved within it like shadows crawling through fire, and she said, "I will speak to them, and I will not be afraid, and I will not give them what they left behind until I know they deserve to take it back." Cade said, "You may not get the chance to speak, and they may not come in peace, and they may not see you as a person, but only as a container, and that is why you must know how to protect what is inside you." He walked to the wall and pulled away a hidden panel, and inside was a black case with a handprint scanner, and he placed his hand, and the case opened with a soft hiss, and inside was a small silver ring with lines that pulsed like veins. "This is a Kalari shield," he said, "and it connects to your biosignal and creates a field around your mind that blocks foreign entry and keeps your thoughts your own, and if they try to take control, this will resist them, but it will hurt, and it will burn, and it will not last forever." Emily took the ring and slid it onto her finger, and the lines glowed in time with her heartbeat, and she felt something wrap around her chest like invisible armor, and she said, "Let them try, and I will show them I am not a gate, I am a guardian." House shook again, and outside the sky split open, and a ship descended slowly without sound and without wind, and it hovered above the trees. with lights that moved like rivers, and a symbol burned into its side that matched the one now glowing on Emily's handcade, stepped back and whispered, "They have returned not as ghosts but as judges, and now they will see what their creation has become, and they will decide whether to destroy it or to kneel before it." Emily walked to the door and opened it, and the air was warm and heavy and smelled like metal and lightning, and she stepped outside without shaking, and the ship above shifted its lights as if looking directly at her. From within the ship a voice entered her mind, not loud, not sharp, just there like a memory waking up, and it said, "You have something that does not belong to your kind, and now you must prove that you are worthy to carry it." She looked up and said, "I do not carry it, I am it, and if you want to take it, you must speak to all of me, not just the code, not just the spark, but the human heart that kept it alive for 10 years in silence and pain and fire." She looked up and said, "I do not carry it, I am it, and if you want to take it, you must speak to all of me, not just the code, not just the spark, but the human heart that kept it alive for 10 years in silence and pain and fire." And the voice did not reply, but the ship began to lower, and the light around her began to change as the past reached for the present, and the first Kalari in 1,000 years prepared to meet the last girl who remembered them. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the ship descended, and the sky above turned gold and crimson like a memory of a star being born, and Emily stood without fear, her eyes steady and her voice calm as the Kalari vessel came to rest above the field near the housecade stayed behind the doorway, watching with eyes full of wonder and worry as the girl who had once lived in silence now stood between the earth and something far older than time, and he knew this moment would either begin a future or end it before it could take breath. The air shimmered around the ship, and the figure began to form, not stepping down, not flying, not walking, but unfolding from light and energy like thought becoming shape, and that shape was tall and smooth, with skin of silver mist and eyes like twin galaxies trapped behind glass. Emily took one step forward, and the ring on her hand pulsed brighter with every heartbeat, and the spark inside her mind began to hum again, not in fear, but in recognition, like a song remembering the one who first sang it. The Kalari spoke without moving its mouth, and the voice entered her thoughts with weight and warmth, and said, "You are the last note of our legacy, and you hold a code not meant for your kind, and yet you have not broken under its fire." She replied with no hesitation and said, "I did not break because I was never just a body and never just a host, and the pain you left behind became the fire that kept me alive, and the spark did not choose me by mistake, it stayed with me because I listened." Kalari paused, and its light shifted slightly as if confused and curious, and then it asked, "Do you know what you carry, and do you understand the choice that stands before you now as the signal nears its final phase?" Emily closed her eyes for a moment, and within that silence she saw again the memory of the world that birthed the spark, and the ruins of a city carved from light, and the fall of those who dreamed too far and feared too late, and she saw herself not as an accident, but as the next verse in a story never finished. She opened her eyes and said, "I carry your past, but I do not belong to it, and I carry your code, but I will not be used by it, and I carry your fire, but I will burn my own path, and if your world died to give me this chance, then I will live loud enough for both of us." The Kalari stepped closer and extended one arm, and from its palm rose a stream of golden symbols that floated in the air like dust from a forgotten book, and it said, "Then take the final sequence and complete the awakening, and become what you were never meant to be, but always could have been." Emily reached out and touched the stream, and the symbols flowed into her skin, and her spine lit with energy, and her legs steadied, and her mind expanded like a sky tearing open to reveal everything that had ever been hidden. She saw the structure of stars and the code beneath molecules, and the fear in the hearts of empires that rose and fell without ever knowing why. And she saw Earth small, but bright, and human hearts full of noise and pain and fire and love. And she saw that she was both spark and soul, both code and choice, both memory and moment, The light around her burst outward in a ring that shook the trees and sent waves into the ground, and the Kalori stepped back as the girl they once would have called a container now stood as something they had never dared to become. Cade stepped out from the house with eyes wide and breath held and whispered, "She is not human anymore. And yet she is more human than anyone who has ever walked this earth." Emily turned to him and smiled, and her body glowed with calm fire, and her voice, when she spoke, carried through wind and leaf and sky, and she said, "I can feel everything, and it does not scare me, and I am not just healed, I am new." The Kalari spoke once more, and its voice was softer now, and said, "Then our journey is done, and our spark has found its future, and we will not return again, for the flame now belongs to this world." Faded into light, and the ship rose without sound, and the sky began to return to blue, and the air was still again, and the stars above blinked slowly, as if watching something sacred take its first breath. Emily walked across the field, and every step left behind a soft trail of light that faded gently, and she reached the porch where her mother stood with tears on her face and arms open and heart trembling. She walked into that embrace and held her close and whispered, "I thought I was broken, but I was only waiting, and I thought I was lost, but I was only learning, and I thought I was nothing, but now I know I am more." And in the sky above, the last golden line of the ship vanished into silence, and the girl who once could not walk now stood at the center of everything, with fire in her veins and hope in her hands, and a universe waiting inside her heart.